right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Camera Academy, starring myself, Nick, and Nikolai over here.
Yes, the only two that will ever do social media at this company.
That's right, and that company is Cameta Camera. We are a camera store from Amityville, New York. That's
a
on
brick
Long
and mortar,
Island.
as we like to say.
That's right. We actually have a store. We're not just one of these crazy fly-by-night online companies.
Nope. Nice small 50-man team here, but that's corporate and warehouse.
Mom and pop. You may know us as as one of the first camera companies that started listing a lot on eBay, and that's sort of where we got our start in the online biz.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history. We started working on our own website, and we're listing on Amazon and Walmart and all that good stuff. So you can get our products anywhere, but enough about us. Let's talk about Aperture, because this is our educational podcast, Camera Academy. And we're going to start talking about one of our favorite topics and one of the most important as well.
Yes, and one of the most requested from just me being tech support and actually getting a lot of questions about Aperture.
Yeah, and also just going through life. If anyone knows that you're a photographer or that you know anything about photography, well, the question of aperture, or more accurately, the question of how do you get those blurry backgrounds, that question comes up a ton.
Yes, and that is a combination of knowing what you're doing and the right equipment.
So we want to help you, the beginning or novice or amateur photographer, know what you're doing. We want to teach you a little bit more about tons of different topics, and we're going to start off with aperture. So, Nikolai, what exactly is an aperture? I mean, let's start at bare bones so people get an idea of exactly what the aperture of your camera, or more accurately, your lens is.
Yes, with most modern digital SLRs and point and shoots and mirrorless, the aperture is fixed inside the lens. And basically what it is, it's the opening that lets light into the lens to hit the camera sensor to expose to get you a picture.
Okay. So basically, the hole that's in the lens that lets light through.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you can basically look at that as people will say that the lens is your camera's eye, or a camera is the eye to the world.
Yes.
There's a bunch of different expressions, but basically the aperture is the opening that can get bigger or smaller depending on the amount of light or how much light you want to let in. And it's basically your eye, the human eye, is like a nice analog, a good way to compare what an aperture is.
Yeah, it's the best way to describe it. A lens is basically just like your eyeball. Your pupil can dilate, it can get really small, and depending on what kind of lighting situation you're in, if it's dark or if it's really bright outside, your iris will change sizes to compensate for the light that's available.
Yeah, and quite often, for some reason, not in still photography as much as in video, but the aperture will be referred to as an iris.
Yes.
So it's basically taking,
It's got a million different names.
It's a direct, yeah, but it is a direct comparison, basically. Your iris is what controls how big and small your pupil is. The aperture does the same thing for your lens.
Except it's mechanical.
Except it's mechanical. Well, if you're a cyborg, then you may have mechanical. Well, never mind.
Oh, that reminds me, have you ever seen Johnny 5?
I don't know what that is. Is it anything? Is it any relation to Ben 10? Because
movie,
I'm very familiar with Ben 10.
The movie Short Circuit. It was like an '80s movie.
Nope.
No.
Sorry.
Wow.
Inform us all, please, Nikolai.
Usually pretty good. Well, the robot that they used in that, his eyeballs are actually lenses.
Oh, they're like, okay,
I'm pretty sure that they're lenses, because I've seen it and they look like camera lenses that I think they use.
Have you seen The Iron Giant?
I have.
Okay, so I was watching this the other day with my friend and our two kids, and we're both photography geeks. So we were just watching it, and I told them, you know what I really like about this movie? The robot's eyes are apertures, and then they only turn into apertures when he gets angry, right? So they turn red, and then the blades come in, and we were trying to figure out how many blades are in the aperture. I think we figured out it was a 5-blade aperture, which is a little bit low tech.
I wonder what f-stop he was at when he's angry.
Maybe we should actually talk about these terms before we get into pop culture references. All right, so we know what the aperture is. Basically, it's a hole that lets light into the camera. Now, it can be adjusted to affect the brightness as well as the depth of field. And the way that's adjusted, the way you adjust your aperture is with little clicks, right? So when you turn the aperture dial, or you turn a dial on your camera that controls the aperture.
Yes.
Because most of them are electronically controlled these days. It goes in what's called f-stops. And I believe that stands for fractional stops.
I believe that's correct.
And there's like some whole mathematical formula to tell you how each f-stop is determined, what the number is. But basically what you need to know is that each stop is a factor of 2 from the one before it. So if you have an f-stop of 2.8, that lets in twice as much light as an f4, which lets in twice as much light as a 5.6, and so on and so on. So every time you click to the next f-stop, you will change the amount of light by a factor of 2. Yes. And of course, there's the numbering system that confuses a lot of beginners, but Nikolai here will explain it and make it easy for everybody, including myself, because sometimes even I get confused.
And sometimes, sometimes even I get it wrong, and I know a lot of the professionals that get it wrong too, because it's just weird to say sometimes, but you just know it in your head. But basically, the lower your aperture number, the wider open the lens is, which means it's letting in more light.
Okay, so if you have an aperture of 2, f2, you are going to have a very wide, very large, wide open aperture.
Yes.
Okay. Now, what if you have an aperture that's a higher number, like f16?
That is going to be larger numbers are going to be smaller openings of the aperture. So it's going to be a smaller opening.
And each kind of opening has different advantages and uses, so we'll get into that now. If you were to have your aperture wide open, if you were fortunate enough to have a lens that has a maximum aperture of 1.8, what would you be using that kind of wide open, large aperture for? It's going to let in a lot of light.
That's going to give you your most famous background. That's going to give you your most famous background blurred images that everyone tries to get portrait wise. So that's something you would want to use for portraits. Also could be used in when you have very low light situations and you just need that to let as much light in as can to get you a proper exposure, which can couple into your ISO and your shutter speed, but we're not really covering those in this right now.
Well, as far as shutter speed goes, though, you would want to use a wide open aperture so that you can get a fast shutter speed.
Yes.
And that way you can use those aperture openings for things like sports photography.
Yes.
You know, if you're trying to catch someone in motion, you want to let in a lot of light so that your shutter speed will be really fast.
Absolutely, yep.
Okay. Now, if you were to use a small opening, which you wouldn't use in as many situations, of course, but what kind of situations would you use a small aperture opening in? It's going to let in a lot less light.
Small aperture openings are usually used for kind of still life things that are not going to be moving, and you want to get the maximum sharpness and the maximum depth of field that you can.
Okay, depth of field we'll get into in just a moment.
Yes. So if you want to take like landscapes, like a most popular photographer to know about that is Ansel Adams.
Yep.
He mainly shot f/22 and above his entire career. You know, like street scenes, like city scenes, like cityscapes. Like if you want to like stop, if you want certain things to look still, but then you have things that are in motion and you want to make them blur, like you ever see those pictures like of New York City or any city where you see like the taxi,
you see
like,
those light trails, right?
You see the light trails going through. That's the result of probably a small aperture, a large numbered f-stop.
Right. So a high number
with a slow shutter speed.
Right, and then a slow shutter speed. Yeah, so like we said, with a larger aperture, you can really stop motion if you want. It's great for sports photography. With a small aperture, you're going to need a slower shutter speed to let in enough light, and therefore you're going to get motion blur. Now, most of the time, we don't want motion blur in our photos, but if you're taking a shot of, say, a waterfall or something like that, or like you said, a city, and there are certain things that are in motion that you want to capture, you want to get that feeling of motion, then that's a good way to use a slower shutter speed, and you'll be able to, and especially, like I said, if you're doing a waterfall and it's bright outside, if you're shooting in a very sunny area, you need to basically stop down the aperture to something very small, or else you're not going to be able to get a slow shutter speed. Just sort of the way the light works.
Yeah, so it's more like the higher shutter speeds are mainly made for like artistic or landscape purposes.
Okay, and then right in the middle.
Shutter speeds, or I say aperture?
I don't know what you said. You said You said shutter speeds, but we'll just forget about
Yes, aperture.
Aperture. In the middle, so there's, wide open apertures and there's small apertures, but in the middle resides the sweet spot.
Yes.
And let's learn a little bit more about that.
Do we want to talk about sweet spot first, or do we want to talk about the depth of field first? Because we've mentioned it a few times.
Well, okay. Let's just talk about depth of field, get that out of the way, because that's actually
it's very important.
It's very important. All right. So depth of field is a term that we're going to use a lot in this podcast, in upcoming episodes.
And it's something you really should know as in the beginner photography stages.
Yeah, it's really one of those things you want to nail down early on. Basically what it means is depth of field is the area of the photograph that is in focus from the photographer's perspective. So if you're taking a picture of just a person, right, and you have a very large aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. So everything behind them and everything in front of them is going to be blurry.
Yes.
If you have a very small aperture, then your depth of field is going to be much deeper, meaning that the stuff behind your subject and the stuff in front of your subject will be in better focus, and that distance will change depending on the size of your aperture.
So again, if you want to get that nice background blur of a portrait of somebody, you would want to have a shallow depth of field.
Correct.
And the way you get that is to use the lowest aperture number possible, which is the widest open aperture.
Yes, and if you combine that with sort of separation from your subject from their background, then you can also get more blurring going on. But you definitely want to start with a large aperture.
Yes.
All right, so depth of field, it's pretty easy to explain. It's just one of those things that takes a long time to master.
Yes.
To get a feel for it, especially when you're working with cameras or lenses that have a very large maximum aperture. Like I know that you have a Fujifilm lens that I think it's a 1.2 or 1.4.
Yeah, it's the 56 millimeter 1.2, and it's gonna tie into this, but 1.2 is a very, very, very shallow depth of field.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to focus on somebody's eyeball with that, which is if you're taking a portrait of somebody, just a little tidbit of information, you always want to focus on the eyeball. Always. That's always your focus point. Try taking a picture of someone's nose or somewhere else. It's just the picture's not going to look right.
Yeah, it is tough when you're trying to focus on something. When it gets on the nose, you always want to go
on the
for
eyeball.
the eye. Well, but the eyes are the window to the soul.
But the nose and the forehead are so close, and that's such a shallow depth of field. A lot of times, you could be like your little focus point can be on the eyeball, but it's going to catch their nose or their forehead or their eyebrow, and the eyes are going to be out of focus. It's not going to look right.
Yeah. And sometimes, it's tempting when you're shooting portraits to shoot at the absolute largest aperture you can because you want to get as much blurring, as much artistic blurring as you can. But sometimes you don't want to shoot at, say, a 1.2. Even if you have that lens, you might want to shoot at a 2.8 just so you're not encountering those focus issues. And let's face it, with a depth of field that shallow, if you manage to focus on the eyeball, you might actually have a blurry nose.
Yeah, exactly.
Depending on the size of your subject's nose.
I very rarely use that lens at 1.2. I'm usually at 1.8, the lowest on it.
Mm-hmm.
But that should also factor into the next subject we're talking about, and that is the sweet spots.
Yes. So in between the largest apertures and the smallest apertures, you're going to find a sweet spot, because when you have a very large aperture, usually you're not going to have the sharpest picture. For whatever reason, the way that lenses are made, unless you're getting super, super high-end lenses, you're going to encounter some softness at the different ends of the aperture spectrum. So if you're shooting that lens at 1.2, even if you're shooting something completely flat, it's probably going to be sharper at f4 than it would be at 1.2 or 1.8. And the same is true also for the other end of the spectrum. If you're shooting in a very small aperture, sometimes it'll be soft, and you're also going to encounter an issue called diffraction, which muddies up your image and makes it just kind of look like hot garbage. And it's something that you can't avoid when you're shooting at a very small aperture. If you're going down into the upper 20s and lower 30s, and you really want to avoid those apertures unless you absolutely cannot avoid it. And
Yeah.
if you're like on the surface of the
Yeah.
sun and you have so much brightness, you just can't help it.
Yeah, but I'd say luckily those are f-stop numbers you're really not going to probably use on the daily.
More likely than not, yep.
So that problem is kind of reserved for the higher apertures, which you're not going to really be using too much.
Okay.
Higher
So-
f-stops, I'm sorry, I don't want to confuse anybody.
So let's get right into the middle there where the sweet spot is. Usually it's going to be from f5.6 to f11, let's say, somewhere in the
around there.
middle. Sometimes it can be a little bit lower, sometimes it can be a little bit higher. There are some lenses these days that actually let you micro adjust using like a USB dock. I know Sigma made some lenses like this.
Yes.
And you were able to actually change the area of the best focus, which for most of us we're not going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, that's a little difficult to do, so I would only reserve that for like semi-pros or professionals to do that USB
So let's just
adjustment
say,
thing.
let's just say for most of us, the lay people here, your sharpest photographs, your absolutely sharpest photographs are going to come somewhere around f4, 5.6, usually with mirrorless.
F4 to F11 is a good range.
Yeah. Now, f8 has always been sort of the standard, like the de facto aperture for street photography or photojournalism,
And that's
rather.
honestly going back to even film days too.
Yeah. For whatever reason, it's just sort of a
It's your
good
safety.
rule of thumb.
Yeah.
And they would say there's a famous phrase. I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm not sure if I got it exact, but it's just basically called F8 and be there if you're a
Yeah.
photojournalist. So just make sure you've got your thing set at F8, and you can be sure that you're going to get most of what you want in focused when you're shooting stuff on the fly.
Yeah.
That may not be true if you're in dire lighting situations, but that's why we're talking about aperture. So you
Yes.
learn how to change your aperture and get the best photographs you can out of any lighting situation.
All right, so we covered a good deal of the basics there for aperture.
Well, there was one more thing I wanted to mention. It is called Bokeh. And this is something that it's dependent on the aperture itself, the actual mechanical part. And, we're not talking about the values, the Fs and the how big your aperture is, how small it is.
We're talking like the shape of the blades that make the aperture itself, the mechanical part of it.
So you've probably seen an aperture. If you haven't, take a look inside your lens, take the cap off the back of your lens and look through the glass in the front, and you should be able to see your aperture.
Yes.
And you'll notice that more than likely it has a slightly polygonal shape to it. Less expensive lenses are going to have less blades. And these days, thankfully, they're all kind of curved.
Yeah.
So you get an approximation of a circle.
Yeah.
And that's what you want to get. You want to end up with a circle shape. So if you have more blades, you're going to have a closer representation of a circle. And because most of the blades are curved these days, you usually will get a pretty good circular shape.
Yes.
But the way that actually affects your photographs is when you have lights in the background. So little pinpoints of lights will show up as the shape of your aperture in the background.
And we should also indicate that the bokeh rarely shows up. It shows up when you're using a wide open aperture usually.
Yes. If you want to have, let's say if you're shooting someone, it's the holiday time and you're shooting someone in front of a Christmas tree and you've got a million little points of light behind them. Those little points of light will show up as nice big blurry orbs in the background, and it's going to look really cool. It's going to be a real beautiful looking background for your subject. But in order to get it to look like that, you're going to need to shoot with a larger aperture, meaning a smaller number, and you're also going to want to do that with a decent lens because you don't want to have a bunch of hexagons in the background.
And
You
it
want
would need to
those
be like a
circles.
semi-telephoto lens too as well, I think.
Yes, that is part of it. Focal length is a part of it. So we usually shoot our portraits at 85 millimeters. If you're shooting on a mirrorless, you can probably do 50.
And if you're using you're basically 18 to 55 millimeter, 55 millimeter would be
Right, shoot
your
at the very
longest.
end. So yeah, most cameras come with a kit lens that's 18 to 55. If you're shooting portraits, shoot at the far end of that zoom range. And also bokeh, in addition to just the little orbs in the background or the shapes in the background, because you can modify those shapes. If you look online, you did DIY bokeh, something like that. It's Bokeh. You can make little hearts in the background. You can cut pretty much any shape you want and make your own bokeh.
Yeah, you pretty much
cool.
put a piece of cardboard over your lens and put a shape on there, and just if you have a 50 millimeter prime, that's usually your go-to. You can those little hearts and stars or whatever you cut into it will show up in the pictures in the background.
It's a pretty cool trick. I've done it a few times. Most of the time, I usually don't end up with something I want to keep, but it is a cool little experiment.
Yeah.
But anyway, so bokeh, in addition to that, also refers to the sort of the quality of the blurry backgrounds you get.
Yeah.
So let's say you're shooting a portrait and you're shooting at 2.8 or whatever, a nice wide open aperture. Sometimes that blurry background is going to look nice and smooth, and sometimes it's going to look like fried hell. Sometimes it's just going to be all like wavy and squiggly. They refer to it as nervous bokeh. Sometimes it can get grainy. What you really want, what people always say when they're referring to bokeh, is either smooth or creamy. I don't know why creamy is used. It's not exactly the term I'd use, but people always say they want to get that nice, smooth, creamy bokeh. So you would get that basically depending on how much money you spend on your lens.
Yes. I mean, to give you an example, the Fujifilm lens that I had that we were talking about, the 56 millimeter, there's two versions of it. There's the regular 56 millimeter, and then there's a 56 millimeter called APD. I forgot what it stands for.
Okay.
But you're basically paying an extra $400 or $500 for smoother aperture blades to get that creamy bokeh for the background.
Yeah, and that also has to do with the glass elements. There's so much that goes into lens construction that sometimes it's best to just forget about it and just open up your wallet and say, all right, just I don't even know where to go. It's sad because we...
Did I just depress you?
Well, you and I sit here and we're surrounded by all this great new equipment every day, and we get a little bit of a discount, but we really do want to just geek out and bring all this stuff home.
But it's fine. We work with what we get.
Yeah, and actually I've been pretty happy working with I've had a Sony a6000 for a few years, and I'm still pretty happy with the quality of the images I'm getting, but I think pretty soon I think I'm going to upgrade.
Looking at that A9, huh?
The A9 came into our office earlier this summer, and not to date this podcast, but...
So pretty.
It was nice. Nice electronic shutter, 30 frames per second. Yeah, it was pretty sweet.
And listen, for the level that camera is, that's a decent price for it.
Oh, yeah, it's only several $1,000s. What was it, like $4,000 or $5,000?
Yeah, but I mean, like, you go to, like, Canon or something like that they're like, what? 7,000, 8,000 for their flagships.
By the way, we're not trying to play favorites at all. We've only mentioned your Fujifilm setup like 5 times so far. And
listen, I got Canon, I got Fuji, I have
You've got
Nikon.
a Nikon as well.
Yep. The only one I really don't have is Sony.
All right, so I've got Sony, and maybe someday we'll get Olympus and Panasonic, and we'll just fill out the whole spectrum. But just so you all know, we're not playing favorites here. We want you to buy all of the cameras.
Yes.
So
because we want to buy all the cameras.
It's true. It really is true. All right. So
back on topic.
I think that's about it for this topic. Now that you mention it,
yeah,
there's really not a whole lot more to know about how Aperture works. It's just you gotta start experimenting.
Yeah.
You start using it, learning how it works, not only in general, but with the equipment you have, because Aperture is going to affect every lens, every camera differently. And there's good ways to figure out how it works, like you can experiment in different modes, like Aperture Priority mode.
Yeah, there is an Aperture Priority mode on pretty much every camera, and that's also including like the advanced point and shoots. So the best thing I can suggest, the way I kind of learned back in college, the way our professor made us learn, is go outside on a nicely lit day, put a subject out somewhere, even if it's just like a tree and there's like another tree in the background.
Yep. So stuffed animals work well for this.
Stuffed animals work good. You can even use your little brother or sister or any other family member you like.
Well, they usually don't stand still enough for this experiment, but I get your point.
Put your camera in Aperture Priority mode, which is usually indicated by an A or AV on Canons because they like to be different.
I think that's aperture value, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you set your aperture value as low as you can. So usually whatever stick you have all the way to the left. So the lowest number you can get on that, click that picture, and then just start upping it, and then compare the pictures afterwards and see how the focus changed on it.
Yes. So if you're starting off with your kit lens, your maximum aperture is usually going to be like, what, 3.5?
Yeah, 3.5.
Something like that. So you can start there, get up nice and close on your subject, and just start shooting and changing your aperture and seeing what changes. You're going to notice that the background is going to change a lot. Don't shoot against, a wall or anything like that. You want to have something in the background, trees, buildings, things like that. And then you can see in real time as you take the pictures, because you'll be able to preview them right away. Thanks to the magic of digital photography.
Yeah.
You'll be able to see how the focus changes and what difference just changing your aperture has on your photos. Not only the background blur, but your shutter speed. Because
ISO.
if you're shooting in an aperture priority mode, those things, your shutter speed and your ISO are going to be automatically controlled. So when you're reviewing your pictures, see what your shutter speed is. See if it made a difference with your ability to hold your camera steady enough, because if your shutter speed goes down, or rather, if your shutter speed increases, if your shutter speed is open for longer, I'm trying to make this as easy to understand as possible. If your shutter speed is open longer, you're going to have motion blur just from your camera, from your hands. So maybe start this experiment with a tripod.
Yeah, and just a side note, some DSLRs, and I'm not sure about mirrorless cameras either, but when you use aperture or shutter priority, I think you can have control of your ISO if you want to. So just make sure that you set your ISO to auto just for the experiment.
Yeah, so that's basically it. Just get out there and start shooting. Read your manual, everybody. That's an important thing.
That's one thing I was guilty of when I started. I didn't really read the manual too much.
There's so many knobs and dials and things, especially if you get yourself a higher end camera. You want to learn how to control everything on the fly. You don't want to have to take the camera down and look at the back of your camera and figure out which dial is for which. You want to have it sort of be second nature. So get out there and start shooting and practicing and experimenting and doing these things before your next birthday party or your next barbecue or whatever occasion is coming up next, where you're going to be the sort of the de facto photographer because you're the only one with a decent camera. Assuming you have a decent camera. By the way, like you said, if you have a point and shoot, most point and shoots these days will also come with a control dial, a command dial on the top, where you can switch to aperture priority. So if you have manual control over your aperture, you're going to be able to witness exactly what differences you can make in your photography by controlling it yourself. It's much better than just leaving it up to auto mode.
It's all about experimenting with photography.
Yeah. Yes, it is. I agree. Anything else to add, Nikolai?
I think that's pretty much it for this episode.
Okay.
So where are we actually hosting this?
Well, you'll be able to find this on YouTube. You'll be able to find it on iTunes, of course. You can also find links to it on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Cameta Camera. If you want to hit us up on Twitter, we are just at Cameta on Twitter, and we've also got an Instagram account as well. That's Cameta Camera on Instagram. So there's lots of different social channels, and we'll have information about this podcast and future podcasts on all of those different platforms.
And with that being said, this is our first official episode, so again, this is new to us. So we
Be kind.
not even that. We would really, really like some feedback to know how we did explaining everything. If it made sense to you, if there's maybe something we didn't cover that we should have. Basically, just leave us comments or messages and let us know how it was, and hopefully we did a good job.
Yeah, and we also want to get some questions from you guys. If you're out there and you're listening to this podcast and you want to learn more about photography, if you have any subjects that you specifically want to learn about or any just specific questions, we'll try to address those questions in future episodes. So if you have a question about focal length, if you don't really know what it's all about and you want to know, I don't know, what focal length should I use to capture this or whatever.
Yeah, we can do an episode on focal length.
We can do an episode about that, and you can listen to us blabber about it. It's more fun than just going on Google.
Yes.
So that's pretty much it. So give us some feedback, like, share, Rate us really high on iTunes and all that
Please.
good stuff. And we will be back next time with Camera Academy. So, and also go to Cameta.com and buy cameras and lenses from us. We need your support. We're a small business, and we would be glad to have you on board as one of our fine, valued customers.
Yes. We also don't have an outro yet, so.
Let's just come up with one on the fly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Camera Academy.
Okay, that was okay.
Sure. Bye, everybody.
Later.